The National Press Club welcomes Congressman Sander Levin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and my daughter, Jenny. I can't remember the first session or meeting or event my late beloved wife of 50 years, Vicki, and I took Jenny to. I'm not sure she remembers, but I can remember her at our house in Berkeley on the stairway as we had meetings. And she was 2 or 3 years old, and she would just stay there listening intently. And so she's here today, and I hope, Jenny, you won't be bored. You're still looking at your dad, and he's still looking at you. I decided to focus my remarks essentially on matters before our committee. I thought that might be appropriate. If you would like to ask any question unrelated to Ways and Means, I will turn my cell phone on and text message my brother. So I have it here, especially if it relates to armed services matters and others he's investigating beyond armed services today, as you know. You know, as I sat down to write my remarks, I thought, what were the events of the 27 years that I've been in the Congress? And my colleague Dennis Hertel is here. We served together. Butler Derrick, we served together. And I remembered, I came in the early 80s, the recession, the end of Soviet power and domination. I remember well the debate over the health care bill in the Clinton years. I remember very vividly the Republican takeover of the House. Of course, 9/11 and the war in Iraq. I remember also going home in 1993 after the deficit reduction vote that passed, as you remember, just by a sliver. And we made the mistake, I thought, of having a town meeting. I love them all, but in a place in Warren, Michigan, in a shopping mall with a very low ceiling. And I can still hear the reverberations. It was a rather turbulent meeting. But as I began to write my remarks, I decided that this is different. And so here's what I wrote down. In a democracy, every generation or so, there occur conditions which can be described by what seems a rather strange label, a perfect storm. It's defined, and one of the staff dug this out of an internet, I won't mention which place, in quotes, a rare combination of circumstances that aggravate a situation dramatically. And this volatile combination today includes, and let me just run through them, I think you all know them, and some of you report on them, the deepest economic recession since the Depression, a historic financial meltdown receiving more and more attention, the globalizing of our economy more apparent every day, all of them impacting the families that I represent in the communities, suburban Michigan. Secondly, Bush administration policies that contributed to a historically high level of income inequalities, upper income families doing still better, and middle class families essentially stagnant in their incomes, amidst a historic increase in the national debt, replacing what were projected budget surpluses. And third, and being on the committee, I remember these issues so well. Neglect of public programs intended to provide safeguards for families in need. A disgraceful example, and it's so vivid in Michigan. The doubling of the Social Security disability backlog in 8 years. Hundreds of thousands waiting 2 or 3 years or more for a decision. And an unemployment insurance system that has too often failed to help jobless workers. And last, U.S. trade deficits, the largest in recorded history. Twice as large as the previous record in the 80s, and a major drag on our economy and a contributor to the global crisis. So when such a combination creates, in quotes, a perfect storm, there's rarely going to be perfect answers. The President has said that so often. But also I think it needs to be said that most, if not all, actions will be imperfect, but inaction is more often than not the most imperfect. So in my judgment, major change is the only course, and this will inevitably in a democracy bring a clash of ideas. And from my experience going back decades, the clash has now been intensified by the loss of moderates within Republican ranks. A few of you may remember, Jenny does. Several decades ago, I tried to be elected governor of Michigan against a moderate Republican, Bill Milliken, who has become a good friend of mine. And if I might say so, he and I today are much closer in ideas than he is to those dominant in today's Republican Party. And so healthcare became the arena for this intense battle of ideas and rhetoric. The Obama administration inherited a healthcare system the best in terms of innovation and almost the worst among industrial nations in terms of cost. The unsuccessful Clinton reform effort was followed by 8 years of inaction as costs and coverage problems grew still worse. So we acted. Basic change creates resistance, and the nation heard claims of impending disaster similar to those heard surrounding the passage of Social Security and Medicare. And the staff and I pulled together some of those quotes from the 60s and the 30s. They're not included here because of the lack of time, but they sound so similar, those claims and arguments of decades ago to those heard today. Well, it turned out that prognostications were wrong. The clash, and I emphasize this, has not immobilized but energized those of us in the majority. This happens, I think, when people do what they believe in and believe their actions will be in the best American tradition, spreading the wings of opportunity and of community. Well, we returned last week, and jobs is our number one issue, very much before this committee. The deeper the recession, the longer the traditional lag, as we know, in job creation. Actions have led to significant stabilization, and I think there are more and more signs. When I talk to some of you in the business world, the first question I ask, is it a bit better? And most of you say yes, a bit better. But clearly we have to undertake additional efforts to spur job growth. So, as you know, the President signed the Hire Bill last week, and it has some real incentives for small businesses. And the House approved, unfortunately with only a handful of Republican votes, the Small Business and Infrastructure Tax Act to assist small businesses and extend the very successful Build America bond program, which experts have called, and I quote, one of the economic recovery efforts' biggest successes. Well, we had a hearing last week on green jobs, and a distinguished reporter who is here was there, I think, for all of it. It went from 10 until 6 p.m. It was a useful hearing, I think, and we're now looking at further legislation. and several business spokespersons had something to